On the cold, rainy day of November 25th, Yelina Rabkina was discovered dead in a Staten Island park, her body naked and burned. A horrific scene that echoed the unsolved murders of two other women from the same borough decades earlier. To the world, they are three crime files, but to their families, they were daughters, sisters, and friends who lived lives full of dreams. This is the story of a terrifying pattern of violence, a series of deaths that were officially dismissed as unrelated. The question is not what happened in the woods, but what if a killer has been hiding in plain sight for 30 years? This story begins in a place that has long held a grim secret, the woods of Staten Island's South Shore. It was here, in the secluded expanse of Long Pond Park, that two teenagers, out on a quiet walk, discovered something that would haunt them forever. They weren't looking for trouble. They were simply exploring the area. But then they saw her. A body. It was partially decomposed, wrapped in a silence so profound it seemed to suck the very sound from the air. The first responders, a jaded lot, arrived to a familiar, nauseating smell, a mix of damp earth, decay, and the acrid scent of something burnt. It was a smell that had been present at the discovery of other bodies in other parks, a smell that now seemed to be a grim signature. A crime scene perimeter was quickly established, transforming a quiet suburban park into a macabre stage. Uniformed officers, followed by detectives in plain clothes, moved with a practiced precision, but their grim expressions betrayed the true horror of the scene. They meticulously documented the body, noting its naked state, the advanced decomposition, and the terrible burn marks that covered the skin. The initial findings were troubling, and the investigators exchanged uneasy glances. They were no strangers to violence, but the specific details here stirred a chilling recognition, a sensory detail that felt all too familiar, a haunting echo of the past. This body, now a case file, belonged to Yelina Rabkina. For over a week, her absence had been a growing source of dread for those who knew her. A close friend who asked to remain anonymous would later describe the day she stopped hearing from her. The calls went straight to voicemail. The messages remained unread. Yelina, a vibrant young woman with a new life on a new continent, had simply vanished. Her social media, once a stream of hopeful updates and new friendships, had gone eerily silent. Her friends' growing dread turned to cold fear as the days slipped by with no word and no sign of the person she had so recently shared her dreams with. Yelina's case seemed to resolve itself in the most unexpected and troubling way. The medical examiner's office, after a preliminary investigation, delivered its official verdict: suicide. But for the detectives on the ground, the ruling was deeply unsatisfying. How could a person who had taken their own life end up in a remote patch of woods, naked and with signs of burning? The official conclusion clashed violently with the grim reality of the scene itself. It seemed like an attempt to close a book that had just been opened, leaving a lingering question, a feeling that something about this death was wrong. The questions surrounding Yelina Rabkina's death refused to fade, especially for those who remembered. For them, her case didn't exist in a vacuum. It was a haunting echo of a far colder time on the island. A graphic title card appears on screen, stark and unnerving. 29 years earlier. The images shift to grainy archived news footage. A reporter from 1996, standing near a wooded area, speaks into a microphone. This was the scene of another death, another body left in the woods. This was the case of Susan Dalton, and it was officially ruled a homicide.
Susan Dalton was not a woman who disappeared without a trace. Her life, for all its quiet normalcy, was a predictable rhythm of work, home, and her 3 beloved dogs. When her landlord noticed the dogs had been left alone for days, he called police out of concern. What they found inside her apartment was a chilling tableau. The television and air conditioner still running, a shirt laid out on an ironing board, the iron still plugged in and hot. It was a still life of a life violently interrupted, a single moment in time, frozen forever. This crucial absence of a struggle inside the home suggested her killer was either someone she knew or someone who had surprised her. Investigators at the time were convinced that Susan had been killed somewhere else and her body dumped in the woods. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, nothing to suggest a violent crime had taken place inside the apartment. Her body, found a distance away, was naked and bore burn marks, much like Yelina Rabkina decades later. The plugged-in iron, the running appliances, and the unattended dogs all pointed to a single, terrifying conclusion. Susan was caught completely off guard. She was preparing for her day, a day that never came. The killer came and went, leaving behind a cold case and a family with no answers. Her body had been discovered on September 19, 1996, and the headline from the Staten Island Advance screamed of murder. Susan Dalton, age 37, had been strangled, and her body bore a stab wound to the spleen. The details were grim, but the case remained stubbornly cold. To this day, no arrests have been made, no suspects identified. Her family, overwhelmed by their grief, retreated from public view, their silence adding another layer to the mystery. They refused to speak to the press, a decision that cemented the official record of her death as a tragedy, but offered no further clues to the public. Just 5 years before Susan Dalton's murder, in a far more chilling echo, another body was found in a ditch on Staten Island. The narrative shifts back in time to September 1991. Found by a passerby on Seaview Avenue, the scene was one of extreme violence and profound mystery. Burnt weeds surrounded her, and her hands were bound by handcuffs. This woman was discovered naked, bludgeoned, and strangled. She was a complete unknown, a woman with no name, no past, no future. For the investigators who discovered her, the smell of burnt decomposition was a smell they would never forget. Among the evidence collected from the scene was the single most vital clue of the entire case, yet it was one that would remain a mystery. Lying directly beneath her body, almost as if it had been placed there, was the murder weapon, a blood-stained industrial-use hammer. But this wasn't just any tool. Etched into its wooden handle were 2 words, a small yet powerful detail that could have led to a name, a home, or a motive. The inscription read, Lloyd, L. To this day, the person or company that owned this hammer has never been found, and the bludgeoned woman remains unidentified. With her identity unknown, investigators turned to the few personal details they had. An FBI flyer, distributed nationwide, detailed her last known outfit, a black dress with a pink collar and Tom McCann balloon sneakers. But the most distinctive feature, and the one that offered the most hope for identification, was a small tattoo. On her right buttock was a red and blue scorpion. Someone, somewhere, had to know a young woman with this specific ink. The hope was that this unique detail would be her key to being identified, a final, desperate plea for a name. Every lead was a dead end. The fingerprints, taken at the morgue, were run against both city and national databases, but yielded no match. Nationwide alerts were broadcast. Missing person records were meticulously checked across all 50 states, and the public was asked to come forward. But no one did. The pleas for identification, the hopes pinned on a small scorpion tattoo and a ring watch, all came to nothing. The case went cold. She was buried under the name Jane Doe, her identity lost to time. Her body was given a burial, but the case never found a resolution, a motive, or a name. And then came Susan Dalton's murder. The similarities, the location, the condition of the body were impossible to ignore, and the public quickly began to speculate. But in 1996, a police source was quoted in the Staten Island Advance, making a firm statement, one that would echo for decades. Although the methods were similar, we don't think there is anywhere near a connection. The official verdict was clear: two separate, tragic events, and nothing more. The police, it seemed, had already closed the book on a case that had never truly been opened. But in the world of true crime, where the public's curiosity never rests, a new kind of investigator has emerged. We now meet one such individual, a retired detective who has spent decades re-examining these cases. To him, the official conclusion was not just wrong, it was a failure of imagination. He argues that by treating each case as a separate, isolated tragedy, the original investigators missed the larger, more terrifying picture. They failed to see the forest for the trees, a decision that may have allowed a killer to operate with impunity. What was dismissed as coincidence begins to look like a pattern. A map of Staten Island appears, not as a static image, but as a living document. On it, a pinpoint of light marks the location where the Jane Doe was found on Seaview Avenue in 1991. A second pinpoint appears, not far from the first, at Grimes Hill, marking the site of Susan Dalton's murder in 1996. And finally, a third point of light illuminates Long Pond Park, Yelina Rabkina's final resting place. The geographical overlap is undeniable. These were not random acts of violence, but three bodies, all found in close proximity to each other, a dark constellation of forgotten lives.
Forensic psychologists who specialize in serial crime patterns are rarely surprised by a lack of official connection. They understand that a killer's ritual is not always as obvious as a signature carved into a body. In this case, the ritual was in the details, the nakedness of the victims, the attempt to burn the bodies, and the choice of secluded yet public dumping locations. All of these elements, when taken together, paint a compelling picture of a single perpetrator. The choice of location and method were not random acts of violence, but a consistent, escalating pattern, a ritual that was a signature of a serial killer.
With a pattern established, a profile begins to form. While Yelina Rabkina, Susan Dalton and the Jane Doe lived very different lives. They were all women whose final moments intersected with the isolated wooded areas of Staten Island. These weren't random acts of violence, but a calculated series of assaults on women in and around the parks. The killer was likely a local, someone who knew the secluded areas and could dispose of a body without drawing suspicion. A person whose inner world was consumed by a dark, ritualistic need for control. And so we return to the most powerful and most tragically overlooked piece of evidence, the hammer. The modern-day investigator we met earlier, a man obsessed with the details, walks us through what should have been done. The inscription, Lloyd L., wasn't a random scribble. It was a lead. He outlines the meticulous process that could have been followed, a search for its origin, a check of local hardware stores, industrial supply companies. A list could have been created of every business or person who used that specific brand. This single piece of evidence was a breadcrumb left by the killer, but no one bothered to follow it. But the patterns didn't stop with method and geography. The dates of the murders themselves reveal another chilling consistency. A data visualization appears, showing a timeline of the three events. The Jane Doe was found in September 1991. Susan Dalton was found in September 1996. And Yelina Rabkina, while her death was ruled a suicide, was found in November. The two confirmed homicides happened within a few weeks of the exact same time of year, 5 years apart. This points to a seasonal pattern, a chilling possibility that this phantom of Staten Island emerges from the shadows to claim a new victim every few years, an annual event of a sort. For a brief time in 1991, the name Lloyd L. was a potential lead, but without a direct hit in the database, the trail went cold. Today, our investigator has a new theory, one he's been developing for years. He explains that Lloyd L. could be a person's name, or perhaps more likely, a reference to a long-defunct local business or an industrial supply company that once operated in the area. This is a lead that could still be pursued, a physical artifact that carries a signature, a trace, a clue from the past that could give us a name in the present.
With so many connections between the two 90s murders, it would be easy to assume Yelina Rabkina's death, with its eerily similar details, must also be connected. But her official suicide ruling complicates the narrative and creates a paradox. Our investigator presents a new, more terrifying theory. Either the original killer has re-emerged after decades of silence, or a copycat, someone obsessed with the unsolved murders of the 90s, has emerged. This new, ritualistic act was a direct attempt to confuse authorities and leave a familiar calling card, a signature on a new crime. While Susan Dalton's family has maintained its silence, another family has broken theirs, pleading for help. A new generation of the Jane Doe's family, cousins and nieces who never knew her, have taken up the impossible task of giving her a name. We see a young woman, a sketch of the Jane Doe in her hands, her voice trembling with emotion. "Someone is missing her," she says, her words a raw plea to the public. She's not asking for a killer to be found, just for her cousin to be identified, to be given back the humanity that was so brutally stolen. Decades may have passed, but the internet has given these cold cases a new life. Online forums and social media groups are dedicated to discussing the Staten Island murders, fueled by a collective refusal to accept the official narrative. Armchair detectives dissect old newspaper clippings and share theories, all of them converging on the same haunting conclusion. The official no connection ruling was a result of a lack of tools and perspective, not malice. He speaks of the raw feeling that something was off, but how tunnel vision and the pressures of the job made them miss the forest for the trees. Back inside Susan Dalton's apartment, another seemingly minor detail takes on new meaning. The iron left plugged in. An expert in criminal forensics explains that this small fact is a powerful clue. It suggests her routine was interrupted abruptly, but without a struggle. Was she preparing for a guest? Did she know her killer? The unmade tableau in her apartment is, in a way, a frozen alibi, an event disturbed midway through. Her attacker, it seems, was in such a hurry to dispose of her body that they didn't have time to clean up a single detail in her home.
While her family has remained silent, a neighbor has come forward, their testimony a new and crucial lead. They recall a man they'd seen in the weeks leading up to the murder, a stranger who seemed out of place. He wasn't walking a dog, he wasn't a jogger, he was simply watching. This neighbor had seen him more than once lurking around Susan's building. It was a detail they had long since dismissed as trivial. Could this be the phantom we've been looking for? A small detail, a fleeting memory, but it's now become a new piece of the puzzle. For years, the Jane Doe's identity was an impossible question, a brick wall for investigators. But today, the technology that was a fantasy in 1991 is a reality. Our investigator explains how the full set of fingerprints taken from the Jane Doe at the morgue could be run again against modern databases. DNA from her body could be uploaded to genealogical websites. The hope is that with a single click, a new match might appear, connecting her to a living relative and finally giving a name to the unidentified woman. Beyond fingerprints and DNA, there is another path to her identity. The documentary makes a direct appeal to the public, a new kind of missing persons report. The camera shows a clear digital rendering of the red and blue scorpion tattoo on her buttock. A narrator's voice asks if any tattoo artist, perhaps a now retired one who worked on Staten Island or in the broader tri-state area in the late 1980s or 90s, remembers this design. It's a detail so personal, so specific, that it might be the key to unlocking her name and her history. While the tattoo is a unique clue, the rest of her physical description is equally important. The FBI flyer, now an archived digital image, is highlighted. She was described as a young white woman in her early 20s with shoulder-length brown hair and brown eyes, standing 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighing about 115 pounds. The narrator suggests that a mother, a father, a brother or a sister somewhere in the country might still be looking for a person who fits this description. Someone, somewhere, must be missing this woman, and this small set of details could finally lead to her. In her final moments, the Jane Doe wore a small, curious ring on her finger, a tiny watch face. A modern jewelry expert examines the archived photograph, noting its design and style. This was not a common piece of jewelry. It was likely a gift, a sentimental item that could be traced back to a specific maker or time period. It's a clue to her identity, a final piece of a puzzle that has been missing for decades. This is more than an unsolved case. It's a missing persons report waiting to be read, a cry for help that has been buried in a cold case file for 30 years. With Yelina Rabkina's death, the terrifying thought that the phantom killer has returned, or that a new one has emerged, has shaken the community. We interview local Staten Island residents who express a renewed sense of unease. They speak of the unsettling feeling that a killer, who may have been living among them for decades, has reawakened. The idea that this person could be their neighbor, someone they pass on the street every day, is a chilling and deeply personal fear. The smell of decay from the parks, it's a memory that feels uncomfortably close to home. As a narrative, these 3 cases are more than a collection of tragic events. They are the potential work of a single mind. The investigator reveals that during the original homicides, there was a single person of interest who lived within a close radius of all 3 crime scenes. This individual, a man with a documented history of violence against women, was interviewed and then dismissed as a viable suspect. Why? Because the official verdict was no connection. This lead, a living, breathing person who fits the geographic and behavioral profile, was never fully explored. He was simply forgotten, an invisible man in plain sight. It's easy to blame the police, but the media played a part in this collective oversight. The documentary now shows a rapid-fire montage of old newspaper headlines. The coverage of the Jane Doe's murder focused on the gruesome discovery and the unsolved nature of the case, but was never connected to the later murder of Susan Dalton. Similarly, Dalton's story was treated as a single, isolated tragedy. There was no overarching narrative, no public discussion of a potential serial killer. The media, like the police, failed to connect the dots, and as a result, the phantom of Staten Island remained unseen, and the official conclusion of no connection was cemented. In the present day, in the woods of Long Pond Park, an unofficial memorial has been created. A single, simple wooden cross stands where Yelina Rabkina was found, adorned with flowers, candles, and handwritten notes from strangers. But the notes are not just for Yelina. They also contain messages for Susan Dalton and the unidentified Jane Doe. It is here, in this quiet, unassuming space, that the community has offered its own verdict. They see a connection where authorities saw none. They refuse to let these lives be forgotten, and in doing so, they have created a haunting, tangible testament to the victim's humanity. We are now granted access to the kind of pain that few have ever witnessed. A relative of one of the victims, a woman who has never spoken publicly, shares her story. Her hands are clasped tightly together, her eyes welling with tears. She recalls the day the police came to her door, a day that split her life into a before and after. She speaks of the decades of torment, the sleepless nights, and the question that has haunted her family since. Her words are not an indictment of law enforcement, but a raw, gut-wrenching plea for answers, any answers that might one day bring a sliver of peace. These are not just old headlines and tragic footnotes. They are cold cases that are still solvable. The documentary ends with a direct plea, a call to action for the NYPD to officially re-examine these cases not as isolated incidents, but as a single, terrifying pattern of violence. The hope is that with modern DNA technology, public attention, and a willingness to challenge old conclusions, a new lead, a forgotten witness, a discarded piece of evidence might finally surface. Only then can the phantom of Staten Island be put to rest and the victims finally be given the justice they deserve.